Hey guys, this is Statton, and today I'll be doing another heart to heart with Statton video while going through a dungeon in Neverwinter. This is going to be one of those subjects that isn't all that serious. It's just one of those things that's been on my mind, and I chose now to talk about it, as odd of a subject as it is, because I have only until December, really, till I get my point across. And it has to do with the subject of the Star Wars movies. Now, I can see why some fans don't like the last two movies that came out. I mean, I will admit they're not the best ones of the franchise, but at the same time, they're not, to me, they're not the worst either. They're not as terrible as everybody makes them out to be. It's not that I'm blind to whatever agenda that they're trying to push, but it's more like I just try to ignore it. I um I like some of the changes Disney has done, though there are changes I also don't like. With most things, something has to be really, really bad for me to say I dislike it completely. Especially when it comes to movies. A movie has to be really boring or really bad in some other sense for me to say, "Oh, I don't like that movie at all." Under in a lot of cases, there's times where there are parts of a movie I like and parts of a movie I don't like. I always divide it up like that. And every movie has its flaws if you look hard enough. This is a little off subject, but at the same time, it's an example. I like the Back to the Future movies. I've grown up with those movies all my life, and to this very day, they're still among my favorite movies to watch. However, I do recognize the flaws that those movies have. You see, there's even I even went online one time to look up funny things about Back to the Future, and there I found a few memes and images with talk bubbles over their heads, and not only did they crack off stuff that I thought was hilarious, but what made the jokes even funnier is the fact that they were true. Like, for example, in the third Back to the Future movie, I imagine most of you, if not all of you, have seen the movie, but if you haven't seen the movie and plan on watching it, don't listen to this part. Um, Skip over this chunk of the video. Anyways, in the third Back to the Future movie, when they're setting things up to have the train push the DeLorean because they couldn't get the fuel that they needed to get the DeLorean to run on its own power, so uh, there was a they took an image, a snapshot of Marty and Doc as they're getting ready to take take control of the train, and there's a talk bubble over Marty's head where he says, Doc, why don't we just use the fuel from the old DeLorean that's still hidden in the cave and siphon the gas over to the DeLorean we have now?" Which is true because in the logic of time travel, Doc hid the DeLorean in a cave so that the Doc in 1955, along with Marty, could find it. If it was no longer in the cave, it wouldn't have been there for them to recover it. So, logically speaking, even though Marty went back in time with the newly recovered DeLorean, uh, the one that was the one that Doc originally hid should have still been in the cave. It would have been easier. They wouldn't have had to wait for 3 days for the train to come and go, and it wouldn't have been as life threatening. So there is that is absolutely true, and there are other things like in the first one where instead of there's a flaw in the waiting till the clock tower gets hit by lightning at 10:04 p.m. because as fast as lightning travels, if even if the you know exactly what minute the lightning hits the clock tower, if you take away the first second in a minute and the last second of a minute, that leaves a 58-second time gap for error, which means all you have to do is be off by seconds, and the whole thing would have been a miss, even if you did connect the DeLorean to the wire that the lightning was running through at 10:04. So these are two examples of flaws that movie has. I I do not overlook those flaws. I think about them every single time. Does does that ruin the movie for me? Does that make me say, "Oh, that's not a good movie. That's a stupid movie"? No. I still enjoy the movie for what it is, which is supposed it's a I love time travel stories, and every time travel story has its flaw, and nobody really knows what happens if the past were to be altered. Some people believe in the split timeline theories. Others believe that the past would somehow fix itself. Like, for example, if Marty had disrupted his parents from meeting and he didn't get them back together, he'd fade out of existence. And if he didn't exist, he couldn't have gone back in time to disrupt his own, disrupt the time where his parents had met and fell in love. So it gets a little confusing at times, but I still enjoy them for what they are, which is stories being told and stories that we can watch and enjoy. With Star Wars, it's the same thing. And looking back on it, and I say this now because I know that the internet has become a very common thing today. Uh, and it wasn't as I mean, a lot of people had it back in the days when the prequels were just coming out in theaters, but I also noticed that not a lot of people still had it. There were only a few people I know of at the time that had it, and I definitely wasn't one of them. I didn't grow up with the internet, so I do notice a pattern when it comes to the Star Wars movies, and it seems to repeat itself. And I'm not talking about the movies themselves. I'm talking about the fans in this case. I and doesn't mean all of you, every single individual, but a large group of them. When episode 1 was out in theaters, I remember, I do, you may think I'm making this up, but this is true. I remember people talking about how cool it was and how they loved it. And around the time episode 2 started coming out, people started dissing episode 1, saying it was a boring movie that didn't go anywhere, and how it contributed so little to all the movies that you could pretty much start with episode 2 and not miss anything. Then after episode 2, people were talking about good things about it. They really were. And the thing about, in fact, a lot of my friends at the time even bought episode 2 on DVD and wanted to watch it on the very day that they got it. They and this is after they had seen it in theaters. They just couldn't wait to see it. Well, um, anyways, not too long after that, maybe several months after that, they started talking about how Anakin was was whiny, and how they just thought the movie was heavily flawed, and how Anakin wasn't this perfect person he ought to be. And to be honest with you, to if it's okay to have that opinion, I got no problem with it. But I, at the same time, I don't really have a problem with Anakin, whether if it's the actor or the character. To be honest with you, because you gotta understand the circumstances in which he was in. First of all, I don't think Anakin would have been as likely to have that attitude if he had started if they had noticed him and taken him to be trained at the age he was supposed to be. And yes, they did state in episode 1 he was too old to be trained. Now, there are some Star Wars fans out there that say, well, if that's the case, then Luke should have definitely been too old. Well, he was too old, and Yoda even said that in The Empire Strikes Back. One of the final things he said in protest to training Luke was he was too old to begin the training. And with Luke, that was a huge gamble because not only did they have to train him, but since he was already 19 in episode 2, they had to really take that training and put it in fast forward. And what made it even harder is the majority of the time he was actually training himself. Obi-Wan started training him, but not much longer after that starting point. He had died and became a Force ghost, and 3 years later was sent to Dagobah to be trained for a short time by Yoda. And after that he left, and he had to kind of train himself the rest of the way. He had to practice what he had already known. He had to recover. I don't know if this is still canon or if this has been moved to Legends, but he had to find Obi-Wan's journals and notebooks in his house and read up on them and study on his own without an official master to teach him. He did have a master at one point, Obi-Wan, and a second one, Yoda, but those times did not last very long at all. Anyways, but I'm off subject here. The fact of the matter is, Anakin, if you remember on episode 1, he actually was an innocent child. He had a good heart. He wanted to make a difference in the galaxy. He wanted to free all slaves. He wanted to help his mother, and he wanted to prove to the Jedi Order that he wanted to do good. Now, by episode 2, admittedly, he started developing flaws. He recognized he was the chosen one. He recognized he was more powerful than all the other Jedi, and pride got the best of him. Who's to say if any one of us were in his place, we would do any better? I would like to say, hey, I wouldn't be that prideful. But, truth be told, I don't know. I'm only human. Humans have flaws. Even if we don't see them at the time, and given the right circumstance, sometimes our flaws shine at their brightest, and that's not a good thing at all. And he felt like Obi-Wan was holding him back, and while there is some truth to it, it wasn't just Obi-Wan though, it was the whole Jedi Council. Because of how powerful he was, they didn't trust him, and because he had attachments outside the Order, they didn't trust him. They were afraid that if he went all dark side, which we all know he did eventually, that they wouldn't be able to stand a chance against him. And unfortunately, Anakin recognized that, and it seemed like no matter how hard he tried to prove himself to them, he just wasn't getting anywhere. True, if he had just been more patient and not complained as much, I will admit to that, they would have recognized it probably eventually, or maybe not. We don't really know that to be a fact. It is true that May said, if what he said was true about Darth Sidious being, or about the Emperor being Darth Sidious, and that he will have then earned his trust and his respect, but that we don't really know if that's really the truth or not. I mean, that's what he says, but I think even after, if in the alternate timeline, if Anakin had remained in the chamber of the Masters and of the Council, and let Mace kill Darth Sidious, I don't believe they would have made Anakin a master. I think they would have still been too afraid of his power. And I'm not trying to be apologetic toward Anakin, but I am trying to, on some level, be a little understanding of him by putting myself in his place and asking myself, well, how would I feel if I were in this situation? I mean, there are so many sacrifices, and being a Jedi, from what you can see in the movies, is quite a thankless job, especially if you're the chosen one, because you've got masters that kind of fear you and don't trust you, no matter how much how often you side with them and fight with them. And a lot of people say that they don't see Anakin as the good friend that Obi-Wan claimed him to be in the original trilogy. Well, if you watch the Clone Wars series, there was a time when he thought his master Obi-Wan had actually been murdered, and he was so angered by this, he was so hurt by this, that he wanted to seek vengeance against the one who killed him. Now, to me, he you don't do that for someone that you don't care about. That shows how much Anakin truly cared for Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was his brother. Not literal brother, but you get what I mean. Now I gotta speed up and kind of cover over the other subjects really quick because I'm halfway into the video and I haven't covered over all the subjects yet. But the point is there was an ongoing pattern where when the Star Wars movies first came out, people acted like they liked them at first, but then not too long afterward, they would find fault with them. The faults that they would see were not voiced right away, at least not by the majority. There might be some that recognized him right on the spot, but because, like I said, the internet wasn't a thing, that could have possibly been it. But a lot of the people I talked to personally acted like in the beginning that they actually liked the prequels when they first came out, and it wasn't until later on that suddenly they acted like that they couldn't stand them, that they just weren't as good as the original trilogy. Then George Lucas sold Star Wars to Disney, and I had my doubts rather how this sequel trilogy was going to turn out under Disney and everything. People, I waited till it came out on DVD before I saw it, so without people spoiling it for me, they actually told me if they thought it was good or not, and almost everyone at the time said they liked it. They said they had only one complaint, and they said and I gave them permission to tell me what it was, even at the risk of spoiling the movie. And they said the fact that Rey was able to just pick up on her Force abilities with no training. Other than that, they loved it. They said, admittedly, it is a rehash of Episode 4, but they loved it. And when I went on YouTube to look up comments and everything, everybody almost word for word stated what people at work told me. And it wasn't until The Last Jedi came out in theaters, and once again, that's another movie I waited till DVD before I watched. I stayed away from details that would spoil the movie for me, but at the same time, I would check and see if people liked it or not. And not only did a lot of people hate it, but then all of a sudden the opinions of The Force Awakens changed and went from people saying they liked it to people complaining because of the fact that it was a rehash of Episode 4. I don't... Sometimes I think we kind of expect a little too much. I mean, I do... Don't get me wrong. The sequel trilogy is not the best work. I admit to that, but do I hate them? No, I don't hate them. In fact, if I ever have a Star Wars marathon, I don't mind watching The Last Jedi or The Force Awakens. Now, earlier in the video, I said that there are changes that Disney made that I didn't like, but there are changes I do like. I'd like to really quick go over some of the changes I do like. One, I like they made it so that the kyber crystals that determine the color of the lightsabers are actually influenced by the person holding onto the crystal. I like that better than them being having the colors already, because it gives the colors more meaning. For example, like like if a Jedi or a Force wielder desires to be more out on the battlefield or see more combat than the other Jedi are, then their kyber crystal will glow blue, and that'll be the color of their lightsaber blade. And those that prefer meditation and studying and through the force itself, their kyber crystal will their kyber crystal will be here at, or I mean their, excuse me, sorry, I'm a little distracted right now. Their kyber crystal will become green, and that will be the color of their blade. And then for the ones that are more, which are the rarer kind of Jedi, and they're the ones that are more like diplomats, and they're the ones that hardly see any combat at all, and are not the best at it. They're the ones that their kyber crystals will become the rare color yellow. Then you got Mace Windu, who, because he had darkness in his heart and he channeled it by creating lightsaber combat form 7, Vapid or Vapid, or I've heard it pronounced so many times. I'm not entirely sure what its true pronunciation is, but what his kyber crystal was purple, which, if you think about it, is actually a mixture of the two colors red and blue. So I do believe his kyber crystal was literally bleeding two colors at the same time. It was bleeding blue for the Jedi part of him, but for the darkness of his heart, it was bleeding red at the same time, which mixed together and became that purple kyber crystal. That's not how it happened in Legends, but if Disney's continuity is going to remain the same on how they change the rules and the kyber crystals, then that's how I see it happening. But I also like the fact that they've made it so that they made a lot, some, not all of it, but some of the things Legends, because we complain, I mean, or some Star Wars fans complain about episode 7 being a rehash of episode 4, but I haven't read all of Legends, but from what I've heard, there's a point where in Legends they kept recycling Darth Sidious over and over and over. Turned out that, oh, he had a secret ship with all these clones, so he kept coming back because every time through the clones, and then once all the clones were destroyed, he found yet another way to come back from the grave. Now, I get it. Darth Sidious is a great villain, but at the same time, when you're recycling the same villain over and over again, to me that is rehashing right there. That's the very thing that you complain about episode 7 being, which is a rehash. I don't mean it in the sense I'm trying to talk down to anybody, but it's kind of like we need to come up with new villains, and that's what Snoke was. And yes, I get it, he died on episode 8, so he didn't really amount to much in the sense of being a new villain, but he was still someone new. And and what touches on the subject even further is I was a little disappointed to find out that that they were bringing Darth Sidious back for episode 9, or that it's rumored, and because once again that goes hand in hand with the legend subject that I just touched on. But there's still a way that they could make it good. Like, for example, if Anakin is in fact the chosen one, but killing Darth Sidious at the end of episode 6 wasn't what brought balance to the Force, which, by the way, at a later time, this is a very huge subject to talk about, but my perspective, or my belief on what is considered bringing balance to the Force, is a little different from how most people see it, and I'll talk about that at a later time. But right now, that's where where killing Darth Sidious probably didn't bring balance to the Force. And they say in the that you have to be more on the good side. You have to be pretty much almost pure to be able to become a Force ghost. So Sith can't become Force ghosts. They can leave spiritual imprints of themselves, which are bound to objects, or limited to being in their tombs, they're not really spirits. Even Yoda called them illusions in the Clone Wars when he spoke to the spiritual imprint of Darth Bane. However, what would make it epic is if Darth Sidious actually found a way to become a Force ghost while still embracing the dark side. That he accomplished something no other Sith has accomplished. And people say, and if Anakin could come back as a Force ghost too, because one thing that people always bring up is the fact that Anakin, when his body was destroyed pretty much in the incident and he became Darth Vader, where he had to have the respirator and the robotic limbs and everything, he was left with only 40 to 60% left of his powers. So and because of that, he would never, as the chosen one, reach his full potential in the Force. Well, but then Obi-Wan said, if you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can most possibly imagine. And he's talking about being a Force ghost. Well, what if Anakin, as the chosen one, and as a Force ghost, he became more powerful than what he would have ever been as Anakin Skywalker, even if the incident that turned him into pretty much a half cyborg or robot, or however you want to call it. I believe as a Force ghost, he'd even be more powerful than Anakin would ever have become in his physical life. I believe, as a Force ghost, Anakin can reach a potential that he had no hope of reaching before, and through that he can bring balance to the Force. Through that, he could take on Sidious's spirit. That's just me. Some of you may think that's dumb. I'm just brainstorming. I'm coming up with ideas on how making Sidious a reoccurring villain could be considered okay without it being considered lazy story writing. Now, that's the only thing I can think of at the time. They may do it, they may not do it. I doubt they'll do it, at least. Anyways, I think when it comes to, if you feel like Star Wars is pushing some sort of political agenda, you got one of two choices. You can either let that ruin the movie for you, or you can ignore that part and see it for what it is, which is a fictional story. I still like Star Wars. And it does have its flaws. It does, but I still like it. I'm not gonna hate it or anything. And yes, I do agree, Rey should have had some screen time for training, but it is what it is in the end. But it is okay to like a movie even if it is flawed, because there's no such thing as a perfect movie. I used Back to the Future as an example, and I may actually touch on this subject further because I've got so many things on my mind in regards to this subject, but I don't have any time to cover over it. In fact, I'll go so far as to say I don't really have any time at all, because in the next minute and a half, I'm going to have to end this, but this is my view not only on Star Wars, but in every movie. It takes a very bad movie for me to say I dislike it completely. Otherwise, you're always going to get me saying, well, yes, you are right. These parts here are bad, but I still like these other parts in the movie. These other parts make the movie bearable still. So, with that, that's all I can touch on for today. I'm gonna go ahead and head back up to the spot where I started, but just before I log out. Okay, here I go. So, anyways, that's the video for today. I hope you all enjoyed it. My name is Statton. Like, share, and subscribe. And you all have yourselves a wonderful day.